joining in the next couple of minutes. So hello everyone and welcome to IABC Asia Pacific's webinar on from the big taboo to doing the right thing to do. I will get that right, Mairi.
Sorry.
It's challenging for me. My name's Zora Artis. I am the chair of the Asia Pacific region, and I'm really excited to be the host today with Mairi Barton SCMP. Mairi Barton and I met at the IABC Victoria Christmas party in November 2012, going all the way back, and I think Ross might even have been there as well. That is at a time when Mairi was an executive at ANZ. I remember that well, and since that time Mairi has expanded into developing her own practice called Pinch Yourself Communications. It's a boutique strategic communication practice with a core belief that good reputations grow from business behaviour and communication with integrity and purpose, nurtured by meaningful connection and storytelling. Now, Mairi's won multiple awards for her work, including the case study that she's going to share with us today. So she's going to take some time, about 35 to 40 minutes, to go through the presentation, and then we'll open up to questions from yourself. So at the bottom of the screen there is a chat box, so feel free at any point in time to add your questions to that chat box, and we will then ask those questions towards the end, at the end of the presentation. So over to you, Mairi.
Fantastic, thanks Zora, and I know you share my passion for mental health, so it's great that you're hosting today. And thank you to IABC Asia Pacific for putting this on. As some of you may know, we were due to present this at the Wellington Fusion 20 conference, which had to be postponed because of the pandemic. And actually it's turned out that you know, this topic is more important than ever. And it was actually Zora who reached out to me and said, let's, you know, would you be happy to put this on, because it's such an important topic right now. And I think that's illustrated by the fact that I was reading in The Australian today that our government is looking at appointing its first mental health officer. I'm trusting that that's an accurate report, to plan the mental health response to the pandemic. So that's a real indication of how serious the mental health challenge of the pandemic really is, and why we should be taking it seriously. The other reason I'm really delighted to share this case study today is because I think Ambulance Victoria deserves absolutely every credit for the work that they've done in this space. It's really strong leadership, and it's been observed by organisations around the world who have looked to learn from them and their experience. So really delighted to share that with you today. And I thank them for their support in allowing me to share this and be an ambassador for the work. I hope you're all doing well and you're as happy as you can be in the current circumstances. And I really just want to put on the table from the outset, if you're struggling, that's okay too. I think we're all struggling a bit at the moment. I know I've had my moments through this pandemic. So it's just important to practice a bit more self-care at the moment. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. Just a caveat at the beginning as well, I am going to touch on some sensitive topics today. If anything raises issues for you and you feel like you need support, please do speak to someone about it. So let's have a quick look at the agenda for today. And there's three sections to what I'm going to cover. The first is a glimpse back in time to my time in New Zealand, dealing with a major crisis there. I thought that would be quite a nice way to get the conversation started today. And then we'll be looking at the AV case study. That's going to be the main part of the presentation today, based on these 7 insights. And then actually insight number 7 brings us back to our communication function and asks the question, are we doing enough to look after ourselves and each other? So as I said, we were due to give this presentation in New Zealand, and it would have been my first time back in New Zealand since being appointed to a role there, an acting role, back in 2011. And when I was appointed to the role in New Zealand, at that point in my career, I'd done about 10 years in journalism, culminating in the Federal Press Gallery in Canberra. I'd served as a media advisor to the Australian government. I'd been head of corporate affairs for an industry association. And as Zora mentioned, I'd served as a global executive for a top 4 listed Australian company, the ANZ. So when I was appointed to the role in New Zealand, I have to say I was pretty excited about it. It was going to be a short-term secondment while they were filling the role on a permanent basis. And it was a real opportunity. It was reporting to the CEO, sitting on the executive team. This picture is actually a view from the apartment that they rented for me on the viaduct in Auckland, which was pretty amazing. And I'd be splitting my time between Melbourne and New Zealand and really getting the opportunity to help them planning for the merger of the 2 brands in New Zealand, 2 iconic brands, and a major piece of work. Reality, though, often does not meet expectation. And the day before I flew out to New Zealand, the second Christchurch earthquake hit and pretty much derailed my expectation of what would be going on while I was there. It was the largest disaster to hit the bank in its history at that time. It forced the closure of 700 branches, 26 branches, forgive me. 700 staff were displaced as a result of that. And obviously tens of thousands of customers were impacted. And actually one of the challenging things for us was that because the communication lines were so badly impacted in and out of Christchurch, it was weeks before we could actually determine that all of our people were safe. And that's usually something you're wanting to do in the first 24 hours or even in the first few hours, depending on the scale of a crisis. And we just weren't able to do that, which was, a real challenge. So unfortunately, while our people were safe, 185 people lost their lives in that earthquake and thousands more were injured. And a big part of our job as communicators was trying to connect with people and using innovative new ways of connecting with them, because our normal channels of reaching customers and staff were down, and trying to connect them with money, but also with other basic necessities like fresh water, toilet paper, hot showers. We set up a facility at the airport and we opened that for staff and for customers. So it was pretty harrowing for the communications team. We were a very small team and, we had people media monitoring, watching what was being announced by government, how it was unfolding, reporting back into our crisis control centre and, watching images. This is a lovely image of someone being rescued, but clearly over the weeks there were also images of bodies being stretchered out of buildings and things like that. So it really was a very challenging situation. And it wasn't very long, perhaps a week or so, before cracks started to emerge in the team. And we had tears in the office, we had some angry outbursts. And I really took that as a sign of people who were struggling but didn't want to let the team down. So they were soldiering on. And I found myself serving as something of a counsellor as well as a leader. And I sent a number of people home for the afternoon to go for a run or have a hot bath, whatever it was that they were identifying was going to help them reduce their stress. And I think I learned a lot during that period about the importance of rostering, because we routinely in our jobs will experience crises of 2 or 3 days or perhaps a week. And you can run hard for that period and then recover afterwards. But when you have a prolonged crisis or issue that's unfolding over a long period of time, as this earthquake recovery did, as the current pandemic is, it's really important to think about how you're rostering and giving people downtime, and coupled with that, rotating people through roles. Because one of the mistakes we made was that we had someone who had a responsibility for media monitoring. We just had them on it 24/7 virtually. And you really do need to give people respite from that trauma. So what did all of that mean for me? Well, ultimately, the 12 to 14 hour days, the stress within the team, the flying in and out, the impact that had on sleep, etc., really did take its toll, and I was struggling. And there was one particular day where I was quite teary and I didn't want the team to see that. So I stepped into the elevator and went outside and didn't get very far, just around the corner to a bit of an undercroft in a neighbouring tower. And I was just pacing up and down there, and it caught my eye that another executive had left our building, was heading in my direction. And even though he was someone that I'd worked with for a number of years, I was embarrassed for him to see me like that. And I just turned into the corner and was pretending to read the posters on the wall and just hoping that he would pass on behind me and not notice me. And the next thing that happened was that I felt the friendly touch of a hand on my shoulder, and he said 4 words to me, which was, "Hey, are you okay?" And it opened up a really amazing conversation where he disclosed to me that he was also struggling. He was finding it really tough, and there were different things that were challenging for him than for me, but we had a great conversation about it. And then he went off to get his lunch and I went back into the office, and he wouldn't have known it at that time, but that was probably the first time that I'd spoken up and admitted to anyone that I was struggling. Maybe even the first time I'd really owned up to it myself. And there was actually a lot more going on for me than what I disclosed to him in that moment. And some of it took me a few years to disclose to my family and friends. But I want to share it with you today because I think it's an important illustration of what can be going on for people. So there's various different versions of this list that do the rounds, and I've just picked one that had things that I thought were relevant to my situation. There was only 2 of these that I wasn't experiencing at that period of my career, and that was the financial issues and illness or injury. But some of these, there were multiple layers to the stresses that I was experiencing. So in terms of death, I'd lost my father, to whom I was very, very close in the year prior to going to New Zealand. And then in the weeks before I flew out to New Zealand, I actually lost a baby to miscarriage. And for anyone who's had any close experience with miscarriage, they call it an ambiguous loss. And it's ambiguous because it's very difficult to grieve. And that was certainly my experience. And I think we're getting better at it as a society, but we don't have great forms of language or support for people going through it. And that was certainly my experience. That put pressure on my relationship, and ultimately we separated. So that was a terrible part of that time. I've shared with you about the new job and the new home, but obviously the added challenges with that was the stress of the international component to that move. And then obviously with job stresses, there was the earthquake, there was dealing with the brand merger, which while it was kind of on the back burner during the peak of the earthquake, there were certain deadlines that just, the train had left the station. There were certain deadlines that still had to be met. And also in the months leading up to going to New Zealand, I'd felt bullied by a co-worker and hadn't really been able to deal with that. So that was still there as an underlying issue. So what does that level of stress look like in a colleague? Well, this is the only picture I have of myself from that time in New Zealand. I'm in the All Blacks changing room at Eden Park in Auckland. We were there with the CEO to film an advert for the Rugby World Cup as part of that brand merger that I mentioned. And there's a few things I want to say about this picture. The most important point is that people are actually very good at putting on a brave face. And if you see a colleague or a friend and you think they may be struggling, ask them if they're okay. Ultimately, I returned to Australia. I remember that I had a couple of weeks off, and I do remember that I slept a lot of it, and I also did a lot of running, because running for me is the best form of therapy, and I was just out pounding the pavement. I had some counselling, and mostly I just was back where I needed to be with the support of my family and friends. And this period taught me a huge amount about resilience and about self-care, and those are things that I practice through to today. And that's really the second point I want to make about this, is that the good news is you don't have to go through anything this traumatic to learn how to look after yourself and to practice really good self-care. And we'll talk a bit more about that when we get to the communications section of the presentation at the end. So let's get stuck into the case study now. And the first insight I wanted to share is about partnering with the experts. While I'm passionate about mental health, I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a mental health expert. So the expertise that I bring to the table is communications, and I'm sure most of you on this webinar are probably in the same boat. But if you want to create a mentally healthy workplace, you really do need to have that expertise to work with you to make sure that you're developing programs that are appropriate and that are really going to work. And in a best case scenario, you would work with those experts, and they could be internal experts or external experts, to assess and develop those programs. At Ambulance Victoria, they partnered with several external agencies who are leading providers of and researchers in the mental health space in Australia. So that included Beyond Blue, Phoenix Australia, who specialise in post-traumatic mental health, and the Black Dog Institute. And they did a lot of work researching, developing the strategy, and then developing the training that they wanted to roll out. Now, you may be thinking that in the middle of a pandemic, you don't have time for all of that, and you're probably right, but that doesn't mean you have to go it alone, because there are enormous amounts of readily prepared materials available online. And in fact, I mentioned Beyond Blue. They have a whole website dedicated to the workplace called Heads Up, and you can access that freely on their website. And then they've supplemented that with specific materials that have been developed for COVID-19, which is fantastic. So just a couple of final points on partnering with the experts. If you're a communication person, that obviously includes partnering with your internal experts, whether that's your HR team, your occupational health and safety people. You may or may not have internal psychological support services. They do at Ambulance Victoria because it's such a big focus. You may not, you may have an external one. Whoever those experts are, partner with them. If you're not a comms person, clearly, this is a plug for the comms profession, but you really do need to be partnering with your internal or external communication experts. So I want to do a poll now, just to check in with you about how concerned your organisation is about mental health during COVID-19. I'm really interested to hear the results of this. So we've got three options: more, about the same, or less. And I really encourage you to fill this out, because it's going to create a more meaningful conversation if we get quite a few people telling us what's happening with their organisation and how you're tracking. So I'm just going to move that and let you keep going with answering. And while you're completing that, let me talk to you a little about what motivated Ambulance Victoria to invest in mental health and wellbeing. So for me, Ambulance Victoria is a fantastic example of great leadership leading to incredible change. And that was led by the CEO, Tony Walker, and by the chair, Ken Lay. And Tony said that he knew something had to change when in 2015, a coronial report found that paramedics were 4 times more likely to die by suicide than the average Victorian. And you might think to yourself that that's not surprising, given the trauma that they deal with day in, day out. But consider this: in actual fact, they also were 3 times more likely to die by suicide than other emergency services personnel, such as police and firefighters. So, and sitting behind that, you would have had a whole range of paramedics who were also experiencing negative impacts to their mental health and their enjoyment of life and work, which means that the paramedics are paying an unacceptably high price for simply doing their job. And also the organisation is paying a price for that, because they would be experiencing increased lost time injuries, increased insurance premiums, falling engagement rates among their staff. So let's have a look at the poll results and how concerned your organisation is at the moment. And I don't think there's any surprises in that for any of us. 87% saying more concerned about mental health and wellbeing of staff. So I'm very pleased to hear that, because I would have been quite concerned if it was less, and even if it was about the same. I think we're all recognising that we do need to ramp up in this space. And in fact, since the pandemic was declared, support agencies around the world have been reporting increased uptake of their services. Here in Australia, 2 of our leading providers of mental health support, Beyond Blue and Lifeline, are reporting somewhere between 30 and 40% increase in demand for service. And as part of that announcement today that I saw from about the government appointment, they're forecasting a 50% increase in suicide directly related to the economic shut down and the stress that comes from that. And that's a bit of a truism, a sad truism, that depressions, economic depressions, cost lives, and that's the concern here. So we recently had a Productivity Commission report in Australia which found that mental illness costs the country an estimated $180 billion a year. And that's for Australia alone, and that's prior to the pandemic. So, you know, caring about mental health is not only the right thing to do and absolutely essential for doing the right thing by our people, but it's also makes good business and economic sense. But there are barriers in the way, and the biggest of those is stigma. Before we get into the insight on stigma, I'd really like to define that for you. And I think this definition from the Cambridge English Dictionary really helps to start showing what the role is that communication can play here. So stigma is a strong feeling of disapproval that most people in a society have about something, especially when this is unfair. And so when you think about that, what we need to be doing as communicators is reducing that disapproval, showing that it's okay to care about your mental health and well-being and to seek help if you have concerns. And I think we are making progress as a community. We do see more sports stars and business people and celebrities speaking up about their mental health, but you know, obviously there's still some way to go, but we are making progress. The insight that I want to share around stigma is that it's both a barrier and a symptom. And when we talk about stigma in the context of mental health, it is often referred to as a symptom, because it's something that if you are experiencing a mental health condition, when you experience stigma, it makes the symptoms worse, leaving you feeling more isolated, more alone, potentially more anxious, more depressed. So it's a big barrier that stops people coming forward to get help. And it's one of the biggest things that communication needs to tackle. And you'll hear me speak a lot about that during the rest of the presentation. What was interesting at Ambulance Victoria was that they had several aspects within their own culture that, coupled with stigma, needed to be addressed in order to create the right culture for a mentally healthy workplace. One of those was a belief that injuries, whether they be physical or mental, were just part of the job. And that was linked to a very strong belief that the patient always comes first, regardless of the cost. And then another cultural aspect they had was quite a masculine culture. It's only been 30 years that women have been able to serve as paramedics. So a masculine culture that meant that it wasn't okay to talk about your mental health. So today I've shared with you one of my experiences, one moment in time in my career, and it was almost 10 years ago. But let me tell you, I agonised about whether to share that story and how much of that story to share with you. And that was because it still felt like a risk, and that's stigma. And the only way we're going to break down stigma is through strong leadership. So we need to create an environment where people feel safe to speak up and to seek help. So is there hope within the current pandemic situation? The title of this presentation, it's a bit of a tongue twister, as Zora said, From Taboo to the Right Thing to Do, came to me when I was thinking about the start of my career as a young journalist and working in the newspaper environment. And I learned for the first time why it was that the newspaper didn't report on suicide. And part of the reason that I was told was a belief that it might give other people ideas. Now, a lot has changed about mental health since then, and you'll see a lot more open reporting about mental health and suicide. And this is where I see some hope in the scale of the pandemic and the mental health challenges that are being experienced. It's deeply concerning and no one would wish for it. Let me just say that from the outset. But the silver lining is perhaps that mental health is really going from being an issue for the few to being an issue of concern for the many. I don't know about you, but my newsfeed has been filling with articles about mental health. We've seen government announcements about new fundings and new initiatives like the one that I shared with you today, and businesses realising that they need to do more. So my hope is that this pandemic, we will look back on it as a moment in time where the conversation about mental health really came into the mainstream. That's certainly my hope. And really, why should it be regarded any differently to physical health? So let's have a look at how stigma plays out in the workplace. At Ambulance Victoria, paramedics were reluctant to talk to a colleague about mental health. And when surveyed, it was around 50% said that they wouldn't feel comfortable to talk to a colleague. They were only slightly more likely to talk to their manager, with about 40% who were still reluctant to talk to their manager. Why is that an issue? We know that early intervention and early support leads to the best outcomes for people. So let's go back to your workplaces. Second poll here. Would you feel comfortable talking to your manager if you had a concern about your own mental health? And we've kept this simple. I know you'll probably think there's lots of nuances and ifs, buts, maybes, and it depends on, but we've made it a yes, no, so we can get a really clear picture here. So really think about a scenario, you know, that in any circumstance, whether or not you'd be comfortable to speak up or not. So we'll just move that to the side. And again, please, as many of you as possible to complete that so that it really adds to our conversation at the end about our own profession. I think that will be great to have some meaningful data. So the next insight is about the factors impacting mental health. And I shared with you my New Zealand experiences. And I think from that short story, you would be aware that what was visible to others was the stress of dealing with the New Zealand earthquake. But as I shared with you, there was a whole lot of other issues going on below the waterline that wouldn't have been obvious to others. And turning back to the case study, when you think about paramedics, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it's just the day in, day out dealing with traumatic events that impacts on their mental health. So you might actually be surprised to hear that there are other quite administrative factors that impact on their mental health. One of those is shift work and the impact that that has on sleep and relationships. And another one is unplanned overtime. So what I mean by that is a paramedic may be due to knock off at 6 p.m, but they get an emergency case at 5:30. They rush out at the scene. It takes them some time to stabilise the patient so that they're well enough to be able to be transferred to hospital, rush them to hospital, then there's the handover to the medical professionals at the hospital and all the paperwork that goes with that. They may not knock off until 10 o'clock at night. By that time, they've missed a birthday dinner or they've missed a dance recital for one of their children. And you can just imagine the kinds of anxiety and stresses that come with that and when that's routinely happening to people. So turning to your workplace, the mental health factors for your people may not be obvious either. In the context of coronavirus, I'm pretty sure we can all list off what we think are the really obvious mental health impacts. And that would be anxiety about the health and impacts and the threat to life, or it could be about the isolation and the loneliness and those impacts. But there's an endless list of other things that could be impacting people at this time. And that could include concern about the vulnerable family members or elderly family members. It could be an increased exposure to domestic violence. It could be the added workload and juggling that's required to do homeschooling with your children. It could be the economic downturn and one of the breadwinners in the family losing their source of income. And many, many, many other scenarios. Those are just examples. So you really do need to take the time to work out what it is that's impacting people so that you know how to address that. And how are you going to know what's a factor for employees? Ask them. It really is that simple. You can survey people, hold focus groups, set up anonymous channels for people to provide feedback, or non-anonymous channels depending on the culture within your workplace. Whatever the usual manners are that you seek input from people, it's really important to get those insights, and armed with that, you can develop programs that best meet the needs of your people. Ambulance Victoria undertook a comprehensive psychosocial wellbeing survey to determine the factors impacting their people and to get a baseline of the mental health for their people so they could track it over time. And then they did a lot of follow-up surveys to determine how well it was progressing in terms of people's willingness to speak up, their understanding, and the stigma elements that we talked about earlier. So moving to the fourth insight now, and I absolutely love this picture. Talk about breaking down stigma, and the stigma that girls, and the voices that said that women can't play Australian rules football. These women need to be celebrated as much as possible. And I also think football is a great role model in how communication is integrated from the outset and forms part of the team approach. The players are involved in it, analysing the opposition team and working with the coaches on the strategy and the tactics that they'll use. They have these huddles at the start of the game where they're making sure everyone's clear on what the strategy is, what the tactics are going to be. If there's adjustments to be made, they huddle again at quarter time and they're communicating about that. And if they need more leadership communication, they've got runners that come on with information from the coach's box about a change in tactic or some advice on how to get the winning edge. So I know I'm preaching to the converted about the role of communication and the role of effective communication. But when it comes to mental health, I don't think you can be successful without integrating communication. And as I covered in the previous point about stigma, it takes many, many things to break that stigma down and to achieve meaningful change. And that includes things like demonstrating organisational commitment, visible leadership, promoting open conversation at all levels of the organisation, fostering the right mindset and behaviours, education and training, partnerships with the experts, as I mentioned, but also working very closely with important groups like unions, like family members. These are all areas where communication plays a key role. And I think it's incredibly important for that communication expertise to be brought in at an early stage when strategy is being developed, not just when it comes time to be implemented. And at Ambulance Victoria, I was fortunate to work with them in the writing and development of their strategy. And this is the strategy document here. And we actually wrote key parts of the communication objectives into the actual wellbeing strategy. And you can see there, objective number 2 is about promoting mental health at all levels of Ambulance Victoria. And what that meant was it was beyond question. That commitment was there, that investment would be made. And but a caveat on that, it shouldn't just be a communication exercise. Too often we see organisations doing what I would regard as token communication or promotional efforts. And if that's not underpinned by proper commitment and proper services and initiatives, people will see right through it, and all you're doing is destroying trust. So I really think it can't be just a communication exercise, particularly if there are deep-seated mental health concerns within your workforce. And that's probably more organisations than usual during this current pandemic. And I think that leads nicely to the next point that I want to make, which is the old launch and leave. As communicators, I think we've probably all experienced this at some stage or the other, whether we like to admit it, unwillingly or accidentally. I know I have. And what happens is that the organisation launches something important and it does it with a big bang, and then you move on to other priorities and you never ever return back to that something important again. And what I would say is that it doesn't work for most things. It definitely won't work with addressing stigma, because as we've been discussing, if stigma was easy to fix, we would have resolved that as a society a long time ago. So, you know, again, it takes real commitment, teamwork, layering of initiatives, sustained effort to achieve that meaningful change. At Ambulance Victoria, the strategy that I talked about, that was a 3-year framework, and they continued to build on that as they reviewed progress. So let's look at what all of that has achieved. Most paramedics, this was about a year or so into the program after major investments in training and communication, most paramedics would now talk to a colleague. So we saw that uplift, and we had about 30% still unwilling to talk to a colleague. So still work to be done, but a great improvement. The vast majority would now also talk to their manager. So we saw an uplift there. We were left with about 25% who weren't comfortable to talk to their manager. So that was a significant improvement. We also found that staff were more empowered to look after themselves and to look out for their colleagues. And those grey boxes that are on screen are the before statistics. And coming now are the after statistics. So 90% were able to identify the warning signs of a mental health issue. 90% were familiar with self-care strategies. And 91% were familiar with the treatments and supports that were available to them, which really gave them the skills they needed to look after themselves and to look after others. Now, I haven't spoken a lot about tactics in this presentation. I like to focus on the strategy, but one of the most important tactics that we did use was storytelling. And the insight to share about that was about the fact that storytelling works, but it isn't easy. Storytelling is one of the most powerful tools available to human beings. That's not new news, but it may take some time and really committed leadership to get it going in your organisation when it comes to talking about mental health. And my advice would be that if you're struggling to get it going inside your organisation, think about who are the voices from outside that you may be able to bring in who can role model that open communication for you. And that applies whether you're in a business as usual setting or during the current pandemic. When we first started this work at Ambulance Victoria, we recognised that stigma was going to stop us from having paramedics telling their story. It just wasn't going to be possible. So what we did instead was we filmed family members to help role model open conversation. And I did some interviews with a wife of a paramedic, a mother of a paramedic, and a husband of a paramedic. And their comments were moving and powerful. And then when we launched the strategy, we introduced the mental health pledge. And the first people to take the pledge were the chairman, Ken Lay, the CEO, Tony Walker, and the CEO of Beyond Blue, Georgie Harmon. And the great thing about the pledge, which we then rolled out through the organisation, was that it didn't require people to talk about their own mental health or mental health concerns, but rather to focus on pledging what it was they would do differently to either improve the situation for themselves or to better care for their team. So it was a really safe way to start a conversation. So these are ideas about how you can think about getting conversations going without putting people on the spot. A few years into the strategy, the video that I'm about to share with you was possible. And I want to introduce you to Paul Kroll. Paul's a clinical instructor, and that means that he both works as a paramedic as well as training young paramedics on the job. So
I guess if I look back on it, it was fairly insidious how it came across me very slowly. As I went from being very keen CI with students and that sort of thing to wanting to avoid work altogether. At the time, I couldn't even look at the uniform or anyone in a uniform. If I'd hear sirens of an ambulance, I'd start crying. All these things were going on. I was calling in sick on night shifts and sleeping in my car, and did that for 3 weeks in a row. And then I just realised that, I needed to do something because it's obviously, there's a lot of stories within AV of paramedics with self-harm and suicide. And thankfully I never had those thoughts, but I was aware that I was on a slippery slope and I wasn't going to get any better just doing what I was doing. One of the things that hit me while I was off, like once a month the CEO's perspective comes out as an email to everyone, and in the past I'd always read them as very clinical and impersonal, and when we got a new CEO, the first one he sent out, I read it and I was just thought, oh wow, this is a real person. And so I emailed Tony just to say thank you. he sort of got back to me within a couple of hours and said, "Oh, if you'd like to have a coffee," which blew me away. You know, the CEO wanting to talk to, you know, me. We caught up probably 3 times in the end over, you know, probably 14, 15 months. Just got a coffee, and each time I'd bombard him with a whole lot of notes and my thoughts and about what I'd been through, what I was going through, and how I thought we could fix it. We've had learning modules about mental health and how important it is within AV. And so I think that really encourages us as paramedics to talk about things like that. I think we've always known it's there but not spoken about it, whereas now at least we're talking about it. And, if people are willing to just have a chat, I think the big thing is to admit that you're not right. If someone asks you or they sense something about it, don't be afraid to say, "Hey, look, actually I am struggling," and just talk. Speaking about it's the biggest thing. So I guess if I look back on...
I've lost count of how many times I've watched that video, and it still actually moves me when I watch it. So excuse me, a bit moved by that. And I really want to thank Paul for allowing us to share his story. I spoke to him in the last week. He's doing great, and really pleased that he gave permission for us to share his story today. If you want to read more about Paul's story, there was a big piece in Global Ambulance magazine that featured more about his story, so I'll share that link on my website after the webinar. For me, seeing Paul share his story is one of the biggest symbols about how far Ambulance Victoria had come, because just the fact that he was willing to share his story was just so important. Every time someone like Paul steps forward and tells their story, it creates a safer space for others to speak up and get the help they need, which is fantastic. So now we're going to move to the final insight, which is about our turning the spotlight back onto our own profession. And for paramedics, we coined the phrase, if we don't care for ourselves, we can't care for others. And they're obviously a caring profession. And it really struck me that the same sentiment applies for communication professionals, but for us it's about helping, because we often find ourselves serving as the helping profession. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with being motivated to help. And in fact, it's one of the things that I'm really proud about being a professional communicator, provided it's aligned to strategy. And if it's not, there can be some real downsides, because it can mean that you end up being really reactive and doing a whole lot of tactical stuff for others. And that can be a real issue during a crisis, because it drives massive workload, because really, when's enough? So right now, we're all playing a vital role in helping our organisations plan and manage through the pandemic. And we rightly get swept up with helping the organisation, ensuring that management, staff, media, the community, customers, whatever stakeholders we're dealing with, have what they need. And the key message here is really, you can't maintain that. You can't help others if you don't look after yourself. So let's go back to your poll results, because that's going to give us an insight on how the first step, which is being prepared to speak up. And 87% of, oh, it just flashed off, but I saw that it said 87% of people. Oh, here we go, sorry. 57% of people said yes, they would be comfortable to share a concern about their own mental health, and 43% said no. So that's quite a balanced spread there. To be honest, I'm perhaps a little bit surprised about it being more skewed toward people being willing. And I think that often does come down to the relationship that you have with your line manager. So if you do have a trusting relationship with your line manager, it's often easier to broach these subjects. But still a large swathe of people there who wouldn't be comfortable to speak up. And that really is the first step toward getting help. So important to sort of reflect on that in your own workplace. I spoke earlier also about the importance of research, and we don't have a really great picture across Asia Pacific about what's happening for people within our function. But we do have some research to draw upon from the UK and from Australia. And the UK research was quite alarming. It found that 23% of PR staff took sick leave due to stress, anxiety or depression, and 53% blamed work for that. And the factors that they were citing that were driving those outcomes for them were workload, unsociable hours, and unrealistic expectations. Here in Australia, the picture isn't any better. 20% of people in the media, marketing and creative industries were more likely to show signs of depression than the general population, and 29% more likely to show symptoms of anxiety. And at the time of the survey, which was 2018, 57% of employees had symptoms of stress, and of them, 18% were severe stress. And the factors being cited there were the pressure of their own expectations, pressure from others, and juggling multiple responsibilities. And I'm sure that sounds familiar to some of you, if not all of you. So in this context, I'm really pleased to share with you that there is some new research coming soon across Asia Pacific. Deakin University currently has an application in with its ethics committee for a piece of research, exploratory research, that they're hoping to get started in the second half of the year. So I really want to thank Ross Monaghan and Sharon McDonald for their collaboration on that. I'm looking forward to working with them, and we're looking forward to sharing more information about that in due course. And if this comes your way and there's an opportunity there, I really would encourage you to take part, because it's a really important first step. So before we move to questions, let me introduce you to Bruce. Bruce is the original peer support dog at Ambulance Victoria. And as we say, he's a good boy. And he did such a good job that Ambulance Victoria expanded the program. In the last year, they actually expanded it so that there are now 12 support dogs working right across the state. And so that's a really great example of how they've measured the outcomes being achieved, the impact, and then built on their programs. And I've actually been in the workplace when Bruce has come through, and you can immediately feel a shift in the environment, people relaxing, and the ability to have conversations that wouldn't have been possible without him there. Much more natural, much more human conversations, which is really what this is all about. So good on you, Bruce, and team now. And hopefully having Bruce's picture up there, apart from being absolutely delightful, will help us get a good conversation going today. So Zora,
thank you.
Questions.
Thanks, Mairi. I do have some questions. Thank you for sharing your personal story as well as the story of Ambulance Victoria. I think that was amazing, and I know how difficult it is to share your own story and to have that vulnerability to actually do that. So thank you very much. Thanks. Personally, I've been through a whole range of different things from a mental health perspective. I've dealt with it in agency environment. Sometimes you're surprised literally out of the blue when someone has an issue that you just didn't recognise. So I think that was a really valid point. And other times it is quite obvious. It manifests itself in different ways. That research study that you referenced for Australia found that when it came to stigma, 89% of people said that they were willing to work closely with someone who had a mental health issue or depression, but only 29% would tell anyone if they were actually diagnosed. That figure, that 29%, changed subject to whether people were younger or older. So the cohort between 17 to 24, 27% believed that they would be treated poorly if they shared it, yet 48% of those aged 45 to 54 felt that they would be treated poorly, which I found really interesting. Did you see any difference in age cohorts at Ambulance Victoria in terms of how people felt about sharing their mental health issues?
Yeah, I think it was along similar lines to what you've just disclosed there, where a younger generation are coming through with a greater openness, and that's in all aspects of their lives. You know, they've grown up sharing information on social media to a degree that us older folks haven't been as comfortable with, and so that is reflected in the experience at Ambulance Victoria. But, you know, the culture of a place is very much determined by that majority, going back to that definition, you know, what is it that most people are thinking? So if you still have a workplace that has quite a few of an older generation and they're defining the culture and leading the way, it can still be difficult for younger people to feel that it is safe and comfortable to speak up about it. So obviously there is a generational shift happening in Ambulance Victoria as we speak. There's been massive recruitment over recent years and a lot more younger people coming in. So I imagine that will impact things, but they're already well and truly on their way. As I said, this is leading work that they've been undertaking. So yeah.
That's excellent. Kate asks, why do you think some organisations take a strong lead on tackling mental health?
Good question, Kate. I think sometimes it just comes down to how important, how big an imperative is it. You know, Ambulance Victoria could not act. They weren't in a position where they could avoid acting on that information. If you've got suicide rates like that, it's just, you know, just incredibly alarming. So something had to be done. In order to get that done, it still required incredible leadership and brave leadership to say this is not okay and to get on with it. So I think, you know, sometimes it's that, what is that catalyst for change in an organisation? What is that turning point that just means that it's something that becomes front of mind? But I've also worked with other clients where they had incredible, to me, alarming rates of suicide and psychological harm happening within the workplace, who were doing some of what I've described to you as that sort of communication approach and not a really genuine set of programs behind that. And I think that's partly to do with competing priorities in organisations where, you know, there's often a bottom line focus or other things that feel like they're more important. But at the end of the day, what can be more important than the health and well-being of your people, who are the ones who are delivering your service, who are interacting with your customers, who are delivering your brand and your organisation to the public?
It's interesting. I had a conversation about mental health with one of the larger communication firms across the world at a conference in Asia. And I was talking with one of the senior executives, and they were very passionate about mental health, and they were right behind the Mentally Healthy initiative. And they implemented a lot of things in the organisation in terms of, you know, when you can contact someone and when you hold meetings during the day, the flexible work environment, all that sort of stuff. Just to try and make it easier for staff in our sector. And the biggest issue was the pressure that they were getting from clients and the stresses to deliver and still make it financially viable to sustain the organisation, because at the end of the day, if the organisation is not sustainable, there are no jobs. So it's a real balancing act, and that's a particularly stressful time right now that we're going through, where people are trying to balance the two.
Yeah, and there's a lot of demand on organisations at the moment. There's massive restructuring and massive economic upheaval, and you know, people being displaced from roles and services unable to be provided, etc. So I get that it's difficult for organisations, but it really does come down to an assessment of the need. And if you've got people who are dying or suffering severe mental health impacts, I think you've got to act on it. That would be my instinct. That's the right thing to do. But just to pick up on a point that you made there, actually, sometimes we overlook the fact that mental health initiatives may not be directly mental health initiatives. So you talked about some of those work-life balance initiatives, and they were certainly important at Ambulance Victoria, because that then starts to address some of those underlying factors that I mentioned around administrative things like shift work and like unplanned overtime, etc. So trying to get the shifts working better for people to support better sleep and better work-life balance and things like that. So sometimes they may not be obviously mental health initiatives, but they are actually contributing to a mental health outcome.
Exactly. There's a question here from Jenny. What's your advice to comms people who experience role creep when we find ourselves taking on more than we perhaps should be in the midst of a crisis? I see this is often in HR-related comms.
Yeah, that's a massive question and issue, and a whole other webinar, I think. But I think for me, having well-planned crisis communications in place ahead of a crisis goes a very long way. And actually, I was fortunate enough after the New Zealand experience to come back to Australia, and one of the things that I did was built the global framework for crisis response for ANZ and the training program for comms professionals to support that, in order that we were clearer about what our role was, what we would and wouldn't do, what's in scope and out of scope, who would do what, and how we would interact with the rest of the organisation in a crisis. Because when you're in the crisis, that's not the time to be doing that. That's really, it is that cyclical prepare, activate, or prepare, activate, respond, and then learn. So you've got to be doing that prepare stuff before you get into the crisis. But I think within the crisis, if it is already going and you haven't done that groundwork, it is really just about getting clarity pretty quickly about what are the most important things strategically that are going to deliver the most value, and sticking to that if you can. But it doesn't mean that you're not going to get called upon to do things to help the wider organisation that may feel less important to your organisation, and then it becomes a judgment call about how much of that you take on, I think.
Yeah. There's one more question here. What are the key attributes of a mentally healthy workplace in comms industry?
For comms professionals?
Yes.
Gosh, well, that's why we're going to be doing the research, because actually before we land on the tactics, I think we need to be understanding what it is that's driving that for our people. And I put forward one of my propositions there, which is that we do get into that helping mode and we get role creep and we take on a lot of stuff. I do think deep down from my 25 plus year career that is an issue for comms professionals. But, what else is it that's driving it for our people? We really need to ask those questions before we get to the end. But I don't think a mentally healthy workplace for us is that much different to what it is for other people, which is a place where you feel like you're doing purposeful work, where you feel recognised for your work, where you have the ability to get on and do that work, and enjoy your work and your life, and to be able to get support if you need it. Because let's face it, it's part of the human existence that from time to time we do need more support than other times.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to be closing this off because we're almost on top of the hour. So thank you very much. What we're going to be doing is following this up with the recording of the webinar and a link to the 7 key insights that Mairi has put together. She has almost like a cheat sheet.
A checklist.
Checklist. Yeah. There you go. That's a better term. And a couple of other links as well. So I'd just like to remind everyone that we are very conscious of the pressures that people are under from a financial perspective as well. So IABC has got an offer to anyone who's feeling the pressure from a financial perspective, who's due to renew. By the end of the month, there's basically 6 months free membership, as well as anyone who's looking to join. So that's currently available. You can find more of that on IABC Asia Pacific's website. There's also the COVID-19 resource page on iabc.com, which is an excellent page. It's got templates, it's got so much information there, and it's updated regularly. So feel free to use that at any point in time. And we have a number of other webinars coming up each month, and we're also supporting webinars from the chapters, so we're sharing that as a region. So Mairi, is there anything else that you would like to touch on before we sign off?
Just whatever you're doing, give it plenty of heart. I think we need more heart in business communication, and that starts with treating staff as human beings first and foremost. So give it plenty of heart. And a couple of personal thank yous from me. It took a lot of work getting this webinar together, actually, and I had a great deal of support from Yulia Zaitseva, from Will Conyers and Ross Monaghan. So thank you to all of you. Thank you, Zora, and to Sia, who also played a role leading up. And all the team at IABC Asia Pacific. I think you do a fantastic job. And to everyone who joined, thank you so much. I hope you got some good insights there and that it's been useful for you. Take care and stay well.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. And if anyone's free tonight at 8 o'clock, I'm hosting the the midweek comms drop-in. So feel free to join the chat and just talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.